Well, a century-old shipping law that aims to protect domestic commerce is gaining attention and has become the topic of a heavy debate. Here's One America's Stefan Kleinhenz.
While 90% of world trade takes place by sea, a century-old law here in the United States regulates domestic commerce. Now there's a divide today over this Jones Act. Those who say it protects American interests and those who say it strangles the American shipping industry. The Jones Act is a 100-year-old maritime law that regulates shipping commerce in U.S. waters and between U.S. ports. It requires that ships have to be made in America, owned by Americans, and operated by an American crew. But there is now a divide on the century-old shipping law. Some say the act needs to be replaced because it strangles the American shipping industry.
This is one of the most poorly designed laws on the books. It has an enormous number of counterproductive and destructive effects.
But others say it protects American interests.
China is trying to take over the international shipping industry, and if we repeal the Jones Act, we're inviting them to take over internal trade within the United States as well.
Mario Loyola is a senior fellow with the Competitive Enterprise Institute and recently published a report titled America Last: The Grim Reality of the Jones Act, where he says the Jones Act places an enormous cost on America because it creates a preference for imports and exports and penalizes domestic commerce.
The American people are getting taken advantage of in 1,000 different ways that they don't even realize. That's a very primitive and heavy-handed protectionist measure, and it's very poorly designed.
Loyola detailed how places like Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico have very few options for shipping because of restrictions imposed by the Jones Act. But the negative effects of the Jones Act are not limited to the non-mainland states and territories.
You know, most Americans don't realize that Texas oil producers are going bankrupt because it's so expensive to ship oil to East Coast refineries, while those East Coast refineries that would be perfectly happy to take Texas oil can't because the Jones Act makes it too expensive. So they're importing from foreign competitors, a lot of them competitors that the Jones Act lobby treats as adversaries.
Loyola points to the airline industry as an example of what the shipbuilding industry would look like if it wasn't for the Jones Act.
I mean, Boeing, which is thank God, is in an unregulated, unprotected market, leads the world in airline manufacture.
While 90% of world trade is by ship, and America has more inland waterways than the rest of the world put together, people like former Congressman Ernest Istook worry that repealing the Jones Act would lead to foreign competitors like China taking over domestic trade.
If you look only at the question of, can we get something cheaper by outsourcing it to China or to any other place? If you look at that issue in isolation and you don't understand that the question is there national security interest? Do you want to have other countries dominating the means of shipping things?
Loyola says their proposed reform to the Jones Act does not include regulations to the inland waterways.
The reform of the Jones Act is only about a small part of the Jones Act fleet that is the ocean-going part, of which there are less than 100 vessels total.
To that, Istook says,
but they use isolated examples rather than looking at the big picture.
Loyola, however, says China is the main beneficiary of the Jones Act.
And its defenders defend it as a policy of America first, but actually it's a policy of America last, because what it does is it makes it more expensive for an American to ship something to another American by sea than to do something by importing or exporting.
Congressman Istook says it is not about saving money, but protecting national security.
When we take the populist or the American first attitude of things, as opposed to taking the globalist perspective. And a lot of people have come to the realization that taking a globalist perspective invites other countries to prosper at the expense of the American worker.
Congressman Istook also said that China is trying to control world trade by controlling the means by which it is delivered. He said America needs to revive the shipbuilding industry to compete with China, rather than let China take over the industry.
When you look at the fact that China is making about 1,300 ocean-going merchant ships a year, and the United States is only building 8.
To that, Loyola says,
when the Jones Act was passed, the U.S. shipbuilding industry was one of the most powerful in the world. But now the Jones Act has protected that shipbuilding industry to death.
The debate will likely continue, both sides making their pitch, both for the Jones Act.
The Jones Act is not an economic regulation. It's a national security requirement.
And against it.
Repeal the Jones Act.
Stefan, Kleinhenz, One America News, Washington.
Want to see more videos like this? Click on the link below and subscribe to One America News on YouTube, and call your cable provider and kindly demand that One America News is added to your lineup. Call and subscribe today.